Did you get a code enforcement letter from the city or the county? Then you're in the right place. The first thing you should know about code enforcement letters is that they sound a lot more threatening than they really are when you're starting out. Generally speaking, when you get a letter from code enforcement, you generally have a sufficient amount of time to resolve the problem. If nothing else, you will have sufficient time to at least respond to the complaint if it's more severe and more complex. And even if you don't think you have enough time, it's generally a simple matter of asking for a time extension of 30 to 60 days if you need it. But regardless of the time constraints, when you receive a code enforcement letter, you definitely want to reach out to the code enforcement agency. You should understand that when you receive a code enforcement letter, it's generally triggered by a neighbor. These neighbors are upset but generally don't want a confrontation, so they make a call to the code enforcement agency. When these complaints are made, code enforcement generally does not tell you who made the complaint. But the thing you need to understand is someone in your neighborhood doesn't like what's going on your property. Regardless of who submits a complaint to code enforcement, once code enforcement receives a complaint, they generally send out an inspector to inspect the property. Code enforcement sends an inspector out to the property to validate the complaint. They want to make sure the complaint is not frivolous and actually a real, legitimate complaint. Once a code enforcement inspector goes to the property, they generally take photos and do a detailed write-up for their records. The reason why is because they have so many property complaints to deal with that they actually have to keep good notes and records. There's no way any inspector is going to remember every property in every case, and this all has to be documented back to the code enforcement agency. Once a code enforcement complaint letter has been validated, a notice is sent to the property owner, and sometimes they also post a notice on the property itself. It really depends on your local jurisdiction as far as to the specifics of how they will notify the property owner. One of the things you should know about code enforcement is that the majority of their cases is driven by citizen complaints. There is no way that every single building can be inspected by code enforcement inspectors. So they rely on these citizen complaints to go out to these individual properties and inspect them. That's one of the reasons why I always tell people, make sure the exterior of the property looks decent. If the interior of the property doesn't look very good, that's one thing. But absolutely everyone, especially the general public, can see what the property looks like from the curb or when they drive by. One of the things to be mindful is that neighbors that like you will be less likely inclined to report your property than if they didn't like you. So I'm always a big believer in keeping good neighbors whenever possible. Now everybody knows that there's a busybody neighbor that patrols the neighborhood, and they go out of their way to make complaints about people's property. And from what I've been told, code enforcement has to deal with these busybody neighbors. They have to walk a fine line between the sensibilities of the complainer as well as being respectful of the rights of the property owner. So it's generally been my experience that code enforcement inspectors try to be fair to both sides. They know who the busybody complainers are, but they also know the property owners who are repeat offenders that do the bare minimum to keep up with their property. Code enforcement letters are issued at the city or the county level. For example, in Central Florida, in the Orlando area, there are two jurisdictions. There is the city of Orlando and there is Orange County. Depending on where the property is, and if it's in the city limits, the city of Orlando will issue a code enforcement letter. If the property falls outside the city limits of Orlando, it falls within the county's jurisdiction. In this case, Orange County would be issuing a code enforcement letter to the property owner. Even if you're unsure of which code enforcement agency is in effect for any given property, the information you'll need will be in the letter that you receive. So you won't have to guess whether you have to call the city code enforcement or the county's code enforcement. In the example of Columbus, Georgia, it operates under a consolidated government. The city and the county's code enforcement is one and the same. so it does vary from one local area to another. When you receive a code enforcement letter, one of the first things you want to read is to make sure that the complaint is actually valid. You don't want to be receiving a letter for a complaint that doesn't even pertain to your property. And if the complaint does pertain to your property, what you're trying to determine in the earlier stages is if the entire complaint is valid or only portions of the complaint are valid. What you're trying to do when you evaluate the complaint letter is whether it's overstepping or it's being exaggerated. Lots of times the overall complaint is valid, but when you get to the details, it's sometimes not correct. By identifying the details, you can reduce the scope of the overall complaint, and it's a step into resolving the entire situation. In every code enforcement letter that I've ever seen, physical appearance of the property almost always comes up in one way, shape, or form. Sometimes it's an overgrown lawn with overgrown weeds, overgrown bushes. Sometimes there's excessive trash and debris on the property. Getting a code enforcement letter that deals with overgrown lawns, weeds, bushes, and excessive trash are generally considered to be simple cases. What most property owners do in those situations is simply hire someone to do all the landscaping and do the cleanup, and then the problem is resolved. It ultimately gets resolved when you contact code enforcement and let them know that you've cleaned up the property. Then what happens is they will send out an inspector to corroborate your claims, and if everything is cleaned up and everything looks decent, the case is closed. Sometimes a code enforcement inspector will see that you've made a lot of progress, but there may be a couple of deficiencies. In those situations, the inspector will use their discretion. Sometimes they will go ahead and close the case anyway because of the substantial progress that you made. Other times they will hold the case open and ask you to do some finishing touches before they close the case. Either way, a good rapport and good communications with the inspector will go a long way to resolving the matter. I almost always recommend that people take photos to back up their claims. Whether the complaint is large or small, I'm a big believer in getting photos. On more complicated complaints where there are signs of building rot and structural defects, those get to be a little bit more sticky. And the reason why it gets sticky is that it's more than a cosmetic issue. It becomes a safety issue. With rundown or unoccupied properties, deferred maintenance is generally a big issue. It's one thing to have deferred maintenance issues on the inside. It becomes a much larger problem when it becomes more outwardly apparent. For example, you have a rundown unoccupied properties, and the windows and the doors may not be in good condition or entirely destroyed altogether. In those situations, the quick fix is to board up all the windows and board up all the doorways. However, that only works with certain neighborhoods. If the property is in a nicer, affluent neighborhood, the neighbors are not going to like it. It may technically be safe with the windows and doors boarded up, but it's going to be a tremendous eyesore, and they're going to perceive it as affecting their property values. And this is why you have to have a good rapport and open up a dialogue and good communications with the code enforcement agency and their inspector. The objective of code enforcement is not necessarily to tell you what to do and how to run your property. However, they have to balance the public needs versus the private needs of the property owner. Some property owners opt to do the bare minimum to get the complaint off their back. However, the consequence of taking a minimalist approach is that it won't take much for a neighbor to complain about your property again, and then the cycle starts anew with a new code enforcement letter. Now, if all things were being equal, I think most people would agree that you want to take a more long-term view of the maintenance of the property if you possibly can. But in some situations, due to time and financial constraints, doing the bare minimum is about all that a property can sustain. How you go about it will vary a lot on a case-by-case basis. In my view, I'm always trying to identify the source of the complaints and why. The letter is a symptom of a larger problem somewhere else. In this video, it's going to be impossible for me to talk to every single situation that you might encounter in which you receive a code enforcement letter. What I'm trying to do here is give some basic examples and a general framework to work with. I'm happy to report that the general framework that I've adopted in helping others with their code enforcement issues almost always work. They generally work when you have good rapport and communication with the code enforcement inspector. That is the basis of which you work with them and hopefully cooperate to get to the other side. What you don't want to have is have your code enforcement complaint be escalated to more punitive measures. What I mean by punitive measures is being threatened by fines, threatened with a lien, or even threatened with demolition of your property and then charging it to your account. These are all very extreme situations that are done as a last resort. Cities and counties don't want to take over rundown properties. Cities and counties don't want to be in the lawn maintenance and property upkeep business. They don't want to be in the position of issuing fines and then collecting from property owners. There are many things that code enforcement agencies do that they really don't want to do. And when you understand that most code enforcement agencies don't want to do that, you are much more inclined to succeed and get the time you need to resolve these matters. Sometimes with more complicated complaints, you're dealing with an older property which require extensive remodeling, reconstruction, and in some extreme cases, demolition. In some situations, the only way out for some property owners is to entirely abandon the property, or more preferably, you sell the property at an extremely discounted price, so that you no longer have the responsibility of correcting the code enforcement complaints. Having said all that, despite your best efforts to create a good rapport and communicate well with the code enforcement agency, sometimes you're not going to come into agreement. In those situations, you will have the opportunity to go to a hearing to present your evidence and explain your case. Property owners always have the right to document their evidence, make a case for themselves, and explain their side of the story. It's been my experience that if property owners do what they're supposed to do and they can back up their case, they almost always succeed one way or the other, whether it's through the code enforcement agency or whether they have to escalate the matter. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and then subscribe to this channel. That way you will receive notifications when I upload new videos. Again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video.